My name is Bob Richardson. I was addicted to alcohol primarily. I tried just about everything, but alcohol was, as we say in the community of recovery, my drug of choice. I'm the child of an alcoholic who died of his alcoholism in 1966 when he was 36 years old. I was 8 years old at the time, and I have only horrific memories of my father. On the last night of his life, it was November 15th of 1966. All the kids, my two older sisters and my younger brother and I were together with the family in Greensboro, North Carolina, and my father, as with most nights, was horribly drunk. And at one point, my mother tried to settle him and quiet him down. He reached up and grabbed my mother and tried to strangle her in front of all of us. My mother thankfully was able to get away from him, and it was like that scene in the movies where she shepherded us all into a room and said, "No matter what you hear, don't come out." My father was arrested. He was thrown into jail, apparently, from what I've heard past tense, that he didn't like being in there. He started to kind of flail away at things. He had a heart attack and he died. This was when as I said, I was 8 years old. I thought for the longest time I was never going to be the man that my father was. I held on to that resolve from the age of 8 to 15. And then a boyhood friend of mine introduced me to beer, and I tried it, and it was like a click. Everything just worked. Suddenly I was funny and witty and handsome to the girls, and I could run faster and jump higher. Alcohol just did everything for me. The big book of Alcoholics Anonymous tells us that we know that we don't drink like our fellows. We know pretty much right away that things are different for us. I knew it right away, but did nothing about it. I suffered blackouts pretty quickly into my drinking career, but really did nothing about it. I just thought that this was part of the gig. So I drank through high school. I drank through my first attempt at college, but flunked out because of party and lifestyle. I wanted to party more than I wanted to pursue scholastics. So I flunked out. I started working, partying, and there was never really a time that I recall where I wasn't drinking. I still kind of maintained a lifestyle where I worked out. I ran the Boston Marathon in 1980, but alcohol was always at the foundation of everything that I wanted to do. Through a series of events, as I say, I knew that I was in trouble. Through a series of events, it was almost as if God was knocking on the door and saying, "You're in trouble, and I think you need to turn around." And I didn't pay him any heed. One example of that in particular that always flummoxes me is I had a dear friend. I was living up in New England at the time. I had a dear friend who got hooked on cocaine as I was, but he disappeared for a time, Shane, and then he was nowhere to be found. And then 2 weeks later, he resurfaced when we all heard that he was in a treatment center in Beverly, Massachusetts. And of our circle of friends of about 15 or 20 people, I was the only one that he wanted to visit. And so he asked if I would come and see him. And I went to see him, and we talked for a time and visited for a time. And there was that kind of clumsy little chagrin that he felt and I felt. And at the end of our visit, when we both decided it was time for me to go, he wrapped me up in a hug that I don't think I'll ever forget. And the fellow was 6'4", and I'm about a foot shorter, so I still remember the hug. But then I stepped back, and he stepped back, and he looked at me, and he said, "Bob, don't ever get here," meaning into rehab, into treatment. And I never knew what he meant until 10 years later, I would find myself in rehab too. So it was just a real example for me of God kind of poking at my soul and saying, "Are you paying attention?" And I didn't. So be that as it may, and my addiction really started hitting its awful pinnacle in about 1995. I had moved from New Hampshire to North Carolina. It was really a geographical cure, which is a predominant reality in the field of addiction, where you think you just move and that will make everything better. But you bring along a really lousy piece of luggage, and it's called you. No matter where I went, there I was. And so despite my different environs, I still wanted to drink, and my drinking even got worse. And then in 1996, it was October 29th of 1996, I was popped for DUI for the first time after a long drinking career and dodging that proverbial bullet. But I was popped for DUI. I was taken to the Winston-Salem Police Department here in North Carolina, and I was administered the blood alcohol count or test, or I'm not really sure what was going on, but somebody was testing me, and they did it 3 times because they couldn't believe that I was sitting upright and had been driving a car when I was registering a 4.0 for a blood alcohol count. My blood alcohol count was 5 times the legal limit, and but that was entirely normal for me. I had to drink all the time. I was so physically addicted to alcohol that I needed to drink from the very first thing in the morning to the time that I stumbled back into bed at night. My hands shook so badly that I needed 3 or 4 beers in the morning just to settle my hands so that I could pour my daughter's cereal. But I was popped for DUI. I blew a 4.0. I was thrown into jail, much like my father. I was strapped to a cell, a bunk in a cell. I remember that much. I finally got out of there. I don't know how long I was there, but my wife at the time came and bailed me out, took me to a detox center. In the midst of being in the detox center and getting an assessment done, I suffered seizures and wound up in a local hospital where I went through DTs. I saw red ants all over the wall of my hospital. I had to be strapped again to a bed, and just an awful physical withdrawal from alcohol. I went I was mandated to go through intensive outpatient treatment. I was told by a doctor that if I drank so much as another thimbleful of alcohol that I would die. But I was angry. It was what we call a dry drunk. My bottle was taken away from me, and that's all I focused on. I never focused on recovery. All I knew was that the one thing that provided me comfort had now been taken from me. But for 60 days, I sobered up. I just kind of went through the motions of sobriety, and then on New Year's Eve, leading into the year 1997, I went back out and drank again. I tried to cover it up as best I can, but I went right back to the horrible kind of agenda of drinking. And then on January 9th of 1997, my wife at the time told me to leave. I was on my way from Winston-Salem to Charleston, South Carolina, because my sister Karen lived in Charleston, and she was the only one whose bridge I had not completely burned. And I was on my way to see her. I think somebody had a cell phone at the time and called me in. I must have been weaving around because I was drinking all the way. I was popped again for DUI. I had pulled off the road and gone into a Hampton Inn parking lot somewhere around Charlotte. I was popped again for DUI, and I remember an officer tapping his ring finger on my window and telling me to get out of the car. And then he told me that he wanted me to recite the alphabet, and I said, why bother? And I held out my hands, prepared to be handcuffed. I was handcuffed and put into the back of the car. I was taken to Mecklenburg County Jail and that put into jail, and it was then that I finally got into my jail cell after being held in a holding tank. Got into my jail cell. I was under a blanket that was more holes than cover. I was on a pillow that was in fact a folded washcloth, and I finally said, God, I can't do this anymore. You have got to take this from me. And as sure as you're hearing the sound of my voice, I heard the sound of his, and he said all you had to do was ask. I got out of jail, finally came back to Winston-Salem, went back to the detox center, went through 5 days there, went from there to 28-day treatment in Greensboro, North Carolina, called Fellowship Hall, went from there to a halfway house in Reedsville, North Carolina, where I spent 100 days. just started the process of making my way back. So since that day, January 9th of 1997, though I've had some times where a beer looked awfully attractive, or I have had temptations, I have had triggers, thankfully I've recognized the strategy of prayer and gratitude and just vigilance in holding on to this recovery that I treasure more than I treasure my breath. So thankfully, life has turned around for me. I went from a guy who couldn't hold a job to now I'm a pastor of a 2,000-member church. I get to lead a flock that knows that I am as broken as anybody, and yet recognize the ultimate salvation that comes in giving your life to a power greater than you are. And that's what I've done. And so thankfully I've been able to hold on steadfastly to recovery, to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, and to let people know that in the midst of utter hopelessness, there is hope, that it can get better. And so my life, I'm almost 62 years old now. My life is an absolute treasure. Even we say in the rooms of AA that our worst day sober is better than our best day drunk, and I'm living proof of that.